Hello, viewers. Today's episode is going to focus on the 164th U.S. Army Regiment on Guadalcanal. If any of you guys have been watching any of my videos, you'll notice I've done quite a number of videos on the U.S. Army's involvement on Guadalcanal. There's still some out there who don't even know the U.S. Army was even on Guadalcanal, so I'm trying to rectify that knowledge, and hopefully you get something out of today's episode, because the 164th is one of my most favorite regiments on Guadalcanal and actually in the Pacific War. And you'll see why, especially once we go through their involvements on Guadalcanal. So the 164th U.S. Army Regiment, and I'll move through this slideshow, was federated in February 1941. As you know, America didn't get involved in the Second World War until December 1941. But the powers to be, the war clouds were on the horizon, so they started federalizing some of these National Guard units. And the 164th was one of these units who was federalized. They were initially part of the 34th Division, and then they broke away from the 34th. They're composed of a National Guard, mainly National Guard guys from North Dakota and some South Dakota and some from nearby Wisconsin and Kansas, but they're mainly known as a North Dakota National Guard unit. Once they were federated, they were sent to Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. Try to say that about 7 times, but Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. Down south, these are one of these ready-made camps that they just instantly popped up because they had a lot of these units have been federalized, so they needed to train them very quickly. So some of these photos I've got here actually come from the North Dakota, or University of North Dakota archives. So actually, if you go on, I don't have their website here, their link. I'll see if I can put it in the comments. But there's some great photos, and this is some pre-war photos. And I think this is K Company. Yeah, I think it says K Company, 164th Infantry. So they were federalized in then December 1941. Obviously, Pearl Harbor, it brought the U.S. Into the war. So these guys were sent from Louisiana. They sent to basically garrison California, because at the time California was thought to be subject to invasion from the Japanese. There was a bit of a war panic there, so they were sending troops to the West Coast. So it remained around the Fort Ord area. I think that's, if I remember right, because I trained at Fort Ord many years ago. I think that's maybe North California. Maybe some of you viewers can let me know in the comments. But they garrisoned around that area for quite a while. And then April 1942, they were given the marching orders, or the sailing orders, so to speak, and they went to Australia. So the Japanese were on the move, especially in the Southwest Pacific, and Australia, New Zealand, Fiji, Samoa, New Caledonia, they're all under threat from Japanese invasion. So they needed to garrison those islands very quickly. So they started sending some of these detached regiments. And like I said earlier, the 164th was originally part of the 34th Division, and they had been detached from them. So they were like a regiment without a division home. So they only spent a short time in Australia, then they sent them to New Caledonia. And if you notice on the map here, New Caledonia is the little star down below, and Guadalcanal is in the top bit there with a red circle. So it's not that too far, but then you look through the lower left, you'll see Australia. So the threat was the Japanese were going to continue on past Guadalcanal and to the New Hebrides and New Caledonia, and continue that way on to Fiji, and cutting that vital supply line to Australia. So they couldn't let that happen. So we'll go to the next one here. So I'll get my big face out of the way for you. So early October, General Harmon, who was the commander of the Pacific, the U.S. Army Commander Pacific, overall Army Commander in the Southwest Pacific, not MacArthur, he was on the other side, but the Southwest Pacific was the U.S. Army, General Harmon. And he met with Admiral Gormley, who was the head of the the Pacific Fleet or Southwest Pacific Fleet, U.S. Navy. And he said these Marines needed some reinforcement. When the Marines initially landed on Guadalcanal, they were told they're going to be landing, make the assault, and then a few weeks later, they're going to pull out and the U.S. Army is going to come in and garrison. So they were still waiting for the U.S. Army to come in. So Harmon recommended that, we need to send troops and send them there because, Guadalcanal, the 1st Marine Division had been fighting quite hard, but, they were barely holding on and they needed reinforcements, fresh troops. So the 164th received the orders, and in a large convoy, they left in early October, headed from New Caledonia to Guadalcanal. So they landed on the morning of the 13th of October. Now you'll notice here I've got the bombardment, and some of you guys who are familiar with the bombardment in Guadalcanal history would know this was the night of the battleships, as some Marines in the Army called it. So you'll see my other slides mention why the bombardment and why these battleships came through and smashed the airfield, but I won't go into too much detail on that, other than they were trying to suppress the airfield and suppress the Air Force so they could offload a lot of heavy equipment like their tanks and heavy guns. And because before they can only load them in the destroyers off at night, but they needed to, these big transports were slow. They didn't want to get caught out in the daylight by the Cactus Air Force and sunk. So they had to subdue it. So they sent these 2 battleships, and they fired, I think roughly 1,000 14-inch rounds between 1 o'clock and 3 or 4 o'clock on the night of the 14th. But the 164th had landed. They had landed early that morning. They were unpacking all their stuff. And they were subject to an air raid, and they received their first casualty, had 1 killed in action. They were subject to 2 air raids during the day. So obviously they were a welcomed relief to the Marines. That was the first real U.S. Army, other than the 7th Marines that landed in September. It was the first real U.S. Army reinforcement they had seen. And it had a lot of supplies, obviously, on this big convoy. So they quickly unloaded and they dug in for the night. And unfortunately for these guys, their introduction to Guadalcanal was probably the largest and most severe naval bombardment probably ever suffered by U.S. troops in any war, especially sustained. So there was one story. One of the Marines was sharing a bunker with one of the 164th guys, and he said, "Look," the 164th guy said, "Is it this bad every night?" He goes, "Man, it's not this bad every night." The Marines couldn't portray a false sense of bravado and try to put it on the Army guys, but they were subject themselves to severe bombardment, and you can imagine how bad that was. So I think they had 3, if I got to look at my records, 3 killed that night from the 164th. Overall, there's 41 U.S. service killed during that night, which is, considering the amount of ordnance threw on the island. That's pretty amazing. So that was the introduction to Guadalcanal. So it's a major introduction. So it didn't take him that long. Vandergrift had a fresh unit. So he sent the 164th. You'll notice here, this is a Google map I've just put up yesterday. So this is fairly recent shot of Guadalcanal. I mean, I left Guadalcanal in 2020, and I can see how the vegetation is changed since then. So this is a fairly recent shot of how it is now, isn't today. So you get the top part there. The one says 164th HQ. So that's the site of Henderson Field. Today it's the Honiara International Airport. So the 164th, they put 2 battalions, the 1st and the 2nd Battalion, there to the right. They moved them on that eastern flank. So that was considered a less risky flank. But if you guys are familiar with the Battle of Alligator Creek in August, the 21st, that was where the Alligator Creek there is the top. So that was a major assault there from the Japanese. But the Marines at that stage didn't expect the Japanese assault coming from that direction. The main direction they expected Japanese assault to come from the other opposite direction in the west, from the Canal River area, where the Japanese had a major buildup of forces, including tanks. They were going to push across the mouth of Canal. That's where Major General Vandergrift, the Marine commander, thought the main attack would be coming from. You'll notice in the south there, you have 1/7 Marines. All right. So you had 2. The 7th Marines had that sector of the line, but due to the demonstration that the Japanese a few days earlier, they'd moved the 2nd Battalion of the 7th Marines out of that line and forward, deploy them to the Guadalcanal River, leaving Chesty Puller's 1st Battalion, 7th Marines to man that 2-battalion line. So he had like 2,600 yards with 500 men. So they were very much scattered about. And then they tied in with the 2nd Battalion, the 164th, and the little yellow lines there, the boundaries for the battalions. So that was the scene, and roughly around October the 17th, they'd moved in the line. So that line was quite built up by the Marines. They'd been in there for a couple of months, and they were building it up with bunkers and barbed wire and clearing firing lanes. And some of these next photos here, my friend Peter Flavin, this is originally black and white from the 164th archives. Now, some of these 164th guys actually had their own cameras, which at the time they weren't supposed to have cameras due to intelligence reasons, but there's some great photos from these guys. Some private soldiers had some cameras, and we've got some great evidence today. Thank goodness for that. So here's a great example of this line that the Marines initially had, then the Army moved in the 164th. So these are the 164th positions, and this is a place called Coffin Corner. If you go to one of our previous episodes, you'll have on Coffin Corner, and I go into detail, and I walk the ground, and I'll show you what it looks like today. And I'm displaying the battle a lot more in detail than I will here. But there's some photos. I didn't have this photo on my Coffin Corner video, so this is a new photo. And when the colorization is done right, I love it because it brings out detail. And you can see there's a road in front of the bunkers. You'll see the Army bunkers there. They're basically coconut log and sandbag bunkers. You'll see the bunker hose in the tree line there, and they're facing out. The U.S. Army called that the bowling alley because it's roughly about 2,500 yards long. And at most places, it averaged between 150 to 250 yards wide. It was flat, open terrain, as you can see here. So perfectly killing ground. And these other photos, okay, that's looking, say, from the Japanese point of view, looking toward that bunker line. And unless you blow this photo up, you really can't see it. But there are bunkers in that tree line. And you can see the wire entanglement of barbed wire. And if you look closely, you'll see cans. And they used to put cans with rocks and shell casings as an early warning system. They also used to put fragmentation hand grenades with the pins slightly pulled out. I was speaking to one veteran of the 3rd Battalion, the 164th, and he was telling me he almost blew himself up because one of the Marines left a grenade, obviously for a booby trap, and he missed it, and he almost detonated on him. So he was real careful after that about going forward to the lines. Then that's a scene from the bunkers looking across. So it's coconut plantation on the other side, but that's roughly about 200 yards across, flat, open terrain. And it's a perfect killing zone. This is a sector that the 164th manned. Once again, some more. You can really see some of the cans there. And a gate. The little things in the middle is a gate. They used to make like a wooden gate full of barbed wire, and they used to put that over the openings to allow patrols to move in and out. So another thing about my friend Peter Flavin, he drew this up. So that's a 1948 photo of the Coffin Corner area where these bunker lines were. And that's basically the top bit is north. Oh, sorry, the top bit is south. The bottom bit's looking north. And the 1942 photo is another colorized one by Peter. And it's actually taken from inside a bunker. You'll see that 50 cal machine gun and looking over that kill zone there. That's perfect kill zone. And that's looking facing south down the bowling alley. So these are from the U.S. Army's official history, written by Miller. I highly recommend. These are great maps. If you can get them online too. There's a site online. You just Google, U.S. Army official history of Guadalcanal with Miller, and you get these links to all these maps. And to me, they're the best maps you can get on Guadalcanal Campaign. They're very accurate. They got the topographical features, which I really love. So this is the overall leading to the Battle of Henderson Field. And I've covered it a number of times in my other videos. But the far right is the area we're going to be concentrating on with the 164th. And then we're covering that vital area. Now, won't go into too much details, but what the Japanese plan was going to do, they were going to, at the mouth of Guadalcanal to the far left there, with a regiment reinforced by a company of tanks. They were going to push across the mouth of Guadalcanal. This is all supposed to be coordinated assaults. And once they did that, they're going to hold the two Marine battalions that was forwardly deployed. Then you'll see down to the left bottom, Colonel Oka and his regiment was going to do a flank attack and cut off those two forward deployed Marine battalions. And simultaneously, to the far right, the majority of the 2nd Infantry Division, with about 7,000 infantrymen, 2 regiments abreast, 1 in reserve, was going to charge out of that jungle, which at that stage the Marines hadn't picked up. They were moving because they cut a 35-mile path to the Murayama trail. But unfortunately, they couldn't coordinate their attacks. It was a great plan, but the terrain beat them, and they underestimated the Marine numbers and the mobility of some of the Marines' reinforcements. So if they could have coordinated this attack, it probably would have worked, because it was a great plan. Because you got to remember that 6,000 Japanese penetrating a 2,600-yard line held by 500 Marines. And there was only linear, wasn't in depth in support. So you had a linear. Once you pop that linear line, then they could have got straight in the back, which they would have really caused a lot of angst among the troops, so to speak, in the division. So I've got a blow up. Okay, so that's the overall. And the far right, the concentrates on the 164th is rolling this at Coffin Corner. So fortunately for the Marines and the Army, when the Japanese attacked on the first assault on the night of the 24th to the 25th, instead of they attacked through the thick jungle, they were going to try to go over Bloody Ridge. So that would have gave them a clear, linear, easy path straight to the airfield. But they got pushed off to the right in that thick, flat, swampy jungle. And you'll know if you see my Barcelona episode, you can see how thick and swampy and nasty that terrain is. And there were only about 3 good tracks or trails through there. That was a path of least resistance. The Japanese took those paths of least resistance, and they were able. That's why the Marines were able to handle the Japanese initially, because the Japanese were only attacking platoon, like 40 to 50 men to up to company size, maybe 100 men at a time, and the Japanese would charge straight down the tracks and trails. So the first night, they hit the 7th Marines quite hard, the first time 7th Marines. Now, what happened? You'll notice the 3rd Battalion of the 164th at the top there, they were in reserve. So Puller in the 1st Battalion 7th Marines needed more troops. So what they did was Puller took Chaplain Keel, I hope I'm saying that right. He was the 7th Marines chaplain. And he sent him back. Division had released the 3rd Battalion. That was the only reserve they had. They released them to reinforce Puller's line. So he sent the regimental chaplain up to lead these guys in single file. And they moved in single file up Bloody Ridge and down the supply track. And once they moved down the supply track, what the Marines had, they had about 50 meters behind the line. They had a parallel trail behind all the bunkers. So they sent 1 man from every platoon to lead these U.S. Army guys in. So they walked straight down the supply trail, and they'd almost drop 1 U.S. Army soldier in with a Marine, and that's how they filled the lines very quickly. Lieutenant Colonel Hall was battalion commander to the 3rd Battalion of 164th. He met Puller, and basically Puller said, look, I'm in the middle of a major battle here. I don't know who's senior to who, but I'm in charge tonight. And, I'm going to drop 1 of your men in with hose with my guys. Do you have any objection to that? And Colonel Hall said, no, go ahead. That's a great idea. So they did that. So the Marines up on Bloody Ridge, they said once the Army was interposed in that line, they could really hear the volume of fire go up dramatically. 1, because you had more men in the line, and 2, the U.S. Army was carrying an M1 Garands, which was a higher firepower than the Marines have the 03 Springfield bolt action rifles. But saying that, the Marines, almost every bunker had a machine gun in it. You know, they had scavenged machine guns from crashed airplanes, because you can notice it was Fighter 1 strip not too far between the boneyard or the graveyard. They'd pulled machine guns off that. Some of the Amtraks had a lot of machine guns on them, and initially they used the Amtraks, amphibious tractors, as supply, and then they used to strip some of the guns off those. But almost every bunker had a machine gun in it. So the Marines managed, with the help of the Army, managed to beat off that first assault that night. All right, let me go back to this. So what happened after that? When daylight came, the 1st Battalion of the 7th Marines moved up onto the ridge. And the 3rd Battalion, the 164th, moved in where they consolidated their lines. And they moved in where the Marines were in that jungle flat. So Murayama decided he's going to attack the next night with a major assault. Let me say something. Oop. All right, so this is a map from one of the veterans, U.S. Army veterans. It was there. So the next night, the main assault, came against the U.S. Army. They came against the U.S. Army at a place called Coffin Corner. So if you go to my past videos, you'll see Coffin Corner video. And once again, I go into a lot of detail on that. But you'll notice on this fire support, or this fire plan that Stannard had, the veteran, you've got Coffin Corner, and it was a Jeep trail, singular Jeep trail, and the Japanese concentrated all their major assaults, company after company, on this Jeep trail. So that was their last orders, and they just, still pounding at it, and they wouldn't stop. But you'll notice it says a 37, a 30, a 50, a 37, a 50. So a 37 is a 37 millimeter anti-tank gun, and loaded with about 128 canister shots, of 30 caliber each. So you can imagine the damage that would do. So that was covering it. Then a 30 cal machine gun, 50 cal a heavy machine gun. And then in addition to, you had 60 millimeter and 81 millimeter mortars smashing that area. Then that whole area was pre-registered with Marine artillery fire with 75 millimeters and 105 millimeter howitzers. So that made it into a killing zone. And the U.S. Army were dug in those bunkers. So the only really, and the Japanese didn't have much fire support because they had to move 35 miles, and they left a lot of their artillery in the jungle. So they had light mortars, mainly their 50 millimeter grenade launchers, or the knee mortars, as some people call them. They had the heavy machine guns and light machine guns. They had a few 75 millimeter and 70 millimeter guns they managed to bring up, not much to affect much at all. So the armies were the army soldiers are pretty impervious and protected in those bunkers, as long as they didn't get out of the bunkers. And the casualties they did incur was the ones where it was hand-to-hand fighting, or they received a hand grenade in a bunker, or such as that. So the Japanese did a number of major assaults against the U.S. Army there, the 3rd and 2nd Battalion. There's some good accounts out there, first-hand accounts of these guys, how they were beating them back. So when in the morning of the 26th came, there was literally hundreds and hundreds of dead Japanese in front there. Once again, go to my Coffin Corner video, and I could go into a lot of detail here today, but I won't, because I've already went in detail there. So have a good view of that. And on that video, I'll show you some of the burial pits the Japanese had right at the actual junction of Coffin Corner, where that Jeep trail was. So the U.S. Army stopped them and gained a bit of fame with the Marines. They thought these guys can fight. In fact, Chesty Puller actually said these farm boys can fight. He put it over the radio. And they, some of the Marines, especially the younger Marines at the time, was putting the Army down until they seen how these guys could fight. And they said, man, these guys, And then the 164th started calling themselves the 164th Marines. So after they defeated the Japanese in that major Battle of Henderson Field battles, Vandergrift said, look, it's time to go on a counteroffensive because the Japanese just lost heavily. So I'll just do a push to the Cucamonga. And Vandergrift had always wanted to be going to Cucamonga ever since the beginning of the campaign. He had a few of the Matanikau battles earlier, we discussed. And, there were limited offensive, probably active defense, where just a small counterattack just to try to push the Japanese away from that vital airfield. So on the 1st of November, they decided a major assault. So they were going to, even though the U.S. Army, the 164th, it was great in the defense, they'd never been tested on the offense, which is a different story when you're moving on the offense compared to the defense. I mean, they were still considered a green unit, even though it had been blooded at the Battle of Henderson Field. So maneuvering the field's a different kettle of fish, so to speak. So Vandegrift took that in consideration, and he only committed one battalion of the 164th for this attack. So it's mainly going to be the 5th Marines, and the 2nd Marines are going to be in this attack. So the 5th Marines are going to attack on the 1st of November across Matanical, push to the 1st objective line, and then the 2nd Marine Regiment with the 1st Battalion of the 164th Attachment is going to push past the 5th Marines onto Cucambona. So the 5th Marines moved on the 1st of November, but they encountered a bit of resistance around Point Cruz, and there was a pocket of Japanese that had to reduce, and you'll see 3-5, 1-5, and 2-5. So the 5th Marines were reducing that pocket. And the 2nd Marines, minus one battalion, but the 1st Battalion, the 164th, made up their other battalions for the regiment size. They pushed forward. If you go to Honiara, which is the capital city now, for those who've been there, this is around they pushed about where the Rove police headquarters of the prison is, for those of you who've been there before. So they pushed there and they held. Now, at the same time, they had to stop their attack because information was coming that the Japanese were landing troops around Coley Point, which is opposite of Point Cruz Matanical. It's due east. So Vandegrift thought the Japanese were landing a whole division there. Now, one of the regiments who was involved in the Battle of Henderson Field, which is the 230th under Colonel Soji, had missed the main fighting, had moved further to the west and ended up at Coley Point. So the Marines sent one battalion, or 2nd Battalion, 7 Marines to find out what was going on there. And then they said, look, the 38th Division, the Japanese division, is going to land there. So he had a major threat on his east flank. So he stopped his attack on the west flank, and he sent the only maneuver guys he had at the time was the 2 battalions of the 7th Marines and the other 2 battalions of the 164th U.S. Army. Initially, this operation was under General Rupertus, which was the assistant division commander, but he became sick very quickly with dengue fever, and it turned over to the U.S. Army General Seabury. I hope I'm saying his names correctly. Brigadier General Seabury. So he took command of this operation. So you'll notice in the right-hand top there, and I've actually covered this battle once again too on another previous video on the wounding of Chesty Puller. So go to the wounding of Chesty Puller video, which I only made, I think, 2 months ago. And I'll describe this battle at Coley Point. But with the 164th's involvement, basically the 164th, like I stated earlier, this was the first time these guys were maneuvering in the field, and it was a bit difficult sometimes when the first time you're doing offensive maneuvers. They had a friendly fire incident, which can be expected with green units. And there was a bit of controversy because they didn't close the pocket. There was about 1,600 Japanese in his pocket. And at Gavalva Creek, when they closed them in, the 2 battalions of the 164th didn't join their lines overnight, and they left a small gap there, with the majority of the Japanese escaped through this gap, leaving about 450 in the rear guard, which was later reduced and killed to the man. But there's a bit of controversy there, and it was so much of a controversy that one of the battalion commanders of the 164th was relieved. He was relieved from his command, which is very controversial because he was a pre-war National Guard commander, and he was actually one of the good commanders. So he was relieved from command, and because of that. So the 164th, they pulled them back, and they put them in reserve once again. So Battle of Coley Point was over with. Now, once the Battle of Coley Point was over with, then Vandegrift wanted to recommence this attack, the push to the Cucambona that he started on 1 November. So at this stage, the 182nd, let me just see, I have another slide here now. The 182nd U.S. Army the next big Army unit to arrive had arrived on the island. So they're going to use the 182nd to assist in this offensive operation. And 182nd only been on the island a week. And they were the sister unit to the 164th. I'll go backtrack a bit here now. So yeah, the 164th, the 132nd, and 182nd. There were 3 regiments that was in New Caledonia at the time. And they didn't have a parent division. So between those 3 regiments and some independent artillery and some other independent engineers and other units, they formed a division called the Maricao Division. It was the only division, U.S. Army division, formed outside the continental United States. The Maricao Division, from America, New Caledonia, the Maricao Division. And General Alexander Patch became their commander. And some of you read about the European campaign might heard of the name General Patch, because General Patch later became an army commander in Europe. But he was a division and corps commander here on Guadalcanal. He actually took over from Vandergrift, the overall command of the island. So that was how the New Caledonia, the Maricao Division started. I think they were actually given the 23rd Division as a number too, but they're mainly known as the Maricao Division. So they sent the 182nd up on the 18th of November, the 17th of November. And they were supposed to hold that line there at the Point Cruz. You'll see the Point Cruz line there. But they were a fresh unit, never been in combat before, only been, not acclimatized. So they dug in. The Japanese had some fresh units and they did a counterattack. You can see the little red lines up top there. And they hit the 182nd. It's the only time that in the whole Guadalcanal campaign that was troops reported to run, American troops, and they did. There's over 2 companies of the American soldiers there broke and ran. And General Seabury moved up very quickly. Some of the other officers moved up very quickly, and they basically rallied the troops. And then they called for the 164th. Now, you can imagine, apparently, I read some of the memoirs of the 164th. They wasn't impressed at all. They're very, very mad because, they've been doing it tough for, a good month now. Been on the island. They had suffered, been in a couple of good scrapes, and they were promised some rest. So they're back at Lunga Point resting. But nope, they called the 164th up. So they wasn't impressed with the 182nd initially. But once again, they were a green unit. It can be expected things like this happen. But the 164th moved up, and they were given the task of digging those Japanese out of that line. Now, what the Japanese had done, next slide here. So you look at this slide, that's the Point Cruz area. This is actually taken around the time of the battle from an aerial reconnaissance photograph. And you can see how the jungle, thick jungles in the ravines. And then you get the coral ridges, which are barren. And that little line up top is the coastal tract, or the pre-war government tract, they called it. So that was the 164th had to attack across these ravines. Now, some of you familiar with the earlier attacks by the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines on October the 9th, 1942, is a place called the Ravine, where Chesty Puller's battalion caught a whole Japanese battalion in a ravine. That's roughly where that arrow is, which says 164th. So what the Japanese had done, they dug in on the left-hand side on Hill 82, 83, 84, and the U.S. Army was on the right-hand side. There was a real deep ravine dividing them. But the Japanese were pretty clever. What they had done, they had reverse slope defenses. So they would dig in on the reverse slope, and then they'd put some of the bunkers in the ravines. The only way you can engage those Japanese, you had to go across that ravine, go up the slope, and get on the skyline, and that's when you actually then seen the bunkers. But you couldn't engage them like supporting arms on the reverse slope defense. You couldn't engage them directly on. So it was a pretty clever defense, a very hard defense the Japanese had. So the 164th, between the 18th and 20th, did repeated assaults against this ridge. And they didn't get any headway. I think they advanced 40 yards on one stage, and that was it. So they had to move back. Just put it in perspective, the Battle of Henderson Field, where they killed hundreds of Japanese, they lost 35 killed and 50 wounded. In these 3 days at Point Cruz, taking that Point Cruz line, they lost 117 killed in action and 208 wounded. So it was a very tough nut to crack. And the 8th Marine Regiment had moved up. If you've seen my last video about the 2nd Marine Division on Guadalcanal. I go into a bit of detail what happened here because the 8th Marines moved up and they said, "Oh, we know we're Marines. We'll crack this. You know, your Army step aside." And they hit it and they got smashed too. So this basically became a bit of no man's land. So the Army dug in here. The 164th dug in, and they maintained this Point Cruz line from November the 15th all the way to December the 15th for a whole month, and they suffered repeated casualties on this. It resembled no man's land in World War I. So you had a lot of daily patrols, you had sniping, you had artillery, you know, then you had malaria, you had the disease and all that kicking in too. So if you speak to any of the 164th veterans of the battle, unfortunately not many of them left, but they, especially in memoirs, they really talk about this Point Cruz line, and they did it very tough here. And I've taken a lot of people on tours of Guadalcanal. I've seen some of these week-long U.S. Tour groups come through, and the Point Cruz battles are hardly ever mentioned. But between Point Cruz and Matanical, and I've said this many times before, that was the most intensive and prolonged fighting in the whole Guadalcanal campaign. You know, not Bloody Ridge, not Alligator Creek, but this area here, which hardly ever gets mentioned. It's almost like the Marines landed, 1st Marine Division was there, you fought Bloody Ridge, you fought Alligator Creek, you might have fought the Battle of Henderson Field, then the campaign ends. You know, the Army's not even there, and then we're off to, you know, to Iwo Jima or something, or Ottawa. But yeah, this is very important here. So if you ever, any of you guys ever go, and I hope you do go to Guadalcanal, if you ever stay in the main hotels, which is all the Western hotels, this is downtown Honiara. When you're sitting in those hotels, you're basically sitting on no man's land in a place where a lot of action happened in the Guadalcanal campaign. So this is a sketch. It's a Disposition. It's 0630 November the 23rd, 1942. And this was taken from the U.S. Army Intel records. And you can see how they dug in there on the November the 23rd. And this is where it ended. And they couldn't push anymore. So you can see the objective line to the left there. And heavily fortified is hills 80, 84, 82, and 83. So for those of you who are familiar with Honiara today, that's Lankiki Ridge, Hill 84. And yeah, very, very thick area. I mean, you can't even climb that area today. And when I used to walk in there, I used to think, geez, imagine trying to tack up this thing. You can't even climb up it to this day. You'd actually need roping gear to get up most of it. That's a pretty good sketch. Now, here's some photos from the veterans. Once again, it's from these private cameras. I'm glad they had these private cameras. And these are some of the rear areas that the U.S. Army had. You know, this is their rear area, sleeping quarters and first aid post and command post and ammo points and things like that. Now, when I mentioned rear slope defensive, then the Japanese, they would have their bunkers on the rear slope. So this is a good example of the rear slope. So imagine if this is Japanese, the Americans would tack over the hill, and you know, then the Japanese can get them right on the skyline. But the Americans had their forward bunkers on the military crest, was about 10 or 15 yards down the front slope. And you will see in a lot of my videos, I'll show you some great examples of these, especially around the Bloody Ridge area. It's a bit of a grainy photo, but it's, once again, it depicts how the U.S. Army had their set up on that rear area. I don't have any of the front slopes because you can imagine this is kind of no man's land. If you stand on the front slope taking a photo, you'd probably get shot. But once again, during the day, you read the reports, during the day, a lot of times not much would happen during the day because the Japanese would sleep during the day and they'd come out at night. A lot of infiltration techniques at night. And they used to love to do that, jump into foxholes with their bayonets and pistols and stuff. Another veteran here, 164th. He's on a, you know, I think, if I remember right, this is a first sergeant. You can see his M1 Garand there, ready at hand, ready to go. Not far from it. And they just look so young. You know, I remember when I was in, the first sergeant would be an old looking man. You know, that this guy here was, you know, he'd probably probably 30 years old. He'd be an old man. This is a great photo of a rear slope defense. They're almost on the skyline. You think, oh, geez, they're really exposed, but you're probably on the right-hand side is probably the peak of the hill, the ridge they're on. I've studied this one in detail. There's a lot of great detail in this. You've got the rifles and you've got the ammunition laid out drying in the sun. And you got a guy on the left-hand side there with his binoculars looking at something, obviously not looking at the enemy because, this is the rear slope. He's probably looking back at Lunga Point, wishing he was probably there. And you notice a lot of them are wearing overalls. I noticed in the Guadalcanal Campaign, these initial guys, especially the Maricao Division, they're wearing one-piece overalls or coveralls. I've located a lot of the buckles from that just on these slopes and things. But you notice in the other campaigns, if you look at some of the photos studying the rest of the Pacific, you don't see these overalls or coveralls much. Now, these are all photos from the 164th. So this is back in camp at their bivouac at Lunga. So after they was on this Point Cruz line to the 15th of December, they were relieved. And then they were racked with, had casualties from killed and wounded. And a lot of them were sick. Most of them were sick with malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, all the good nasties you get in the tropics. So they needed a long rest, and they got a long rest. They were never committed to combat anymore in the Guadalcanal Campaign. They were sent back to man the lesser areas of the line and put in reserve. And I think the last month they were there, they were active stevedores, so they were unloading ships and they were kicked back. But there's nowhere on Guadalcanal, especially in the 6-month campaign, was considered the rest area, because you got to remember they were still getting hit with not so much naval gunfire around December. They're still getting hit with air raids, and the pistol Petes, which is 150s and 100 millimeter Japanese heavy artillery, still pounding that area. So there was really no place to rest on Guadalcanal. But it's a lot better than the Point Cruz line where these guys was. So I'd say this is probably around right before they're about to leave. So they're two guys displaying a souvenir they got. Here, I'll just go full screen on this so you can read it. This is a great photo too. It says members of an infantry, should say unit, but members of an infantry formed for the presentation of decoration to men. I don't know who typed this up or written this, but presentation of decoration to men who acted beyond the call of duty in action on Guadalcanal, 1443, the 3rd Battalion of the 164th Infantry. So it's a battalion formation. And you got the battalion commander out front, probably maybe the regimental commander, which was Colonel Moore. And battalion commander was, the 3rd Battalion was Lieutenant Colonel Hall. Probably at this time he wasn't Hall because he was wounded on the Point Cruz line. Lieutenant Colonel Hall, he actually earned a Navy Cross. Vandegrift gave him a Navy Cross for the Battle of Henderson Field. So they're reading out the awards, and they've got a line of soldiers out front there. And I'd say that's 1, 2, 3 companies, maybe 4 companies lined up in typical battalion formation, which is another great photo. Let me see what I got. This is the Marine Cemetery, later become as the, I think, National Cemetery, the All Services Cemetery, once they started putting people other than Marines in the cemetery. Excuse me. See, last video I didn't have any water, so I made a rookie mistake. So I'll make sure I'm hydrated in this one. So yeah, this is PFC Wendell A. Paulson, I Company 164th. And I've got a whole series of these photos. I guess the guys that went around took photos of their buddies. So for some of you might be wondering, the cemetery is no longer there at Guadalcanal. 47, 48, they were repatriated. They were given a choice, the next of kin, either to go back to the military would bring the bodies back to your place of choosing in the States, or it'd go, if not, it would go to the Pacific War Cemetery at the Punch Bowl in Hawaii. I think something, don't quote me on this, but I think about 60 or 70% elected to go back to the United States or their choice of burial. So if you go into the site for North Dakota, University of North Dakota site, 164th, just type in 164th Infantry. I'll see if I can put the link in the comments. And there's a lot of these photos, especially with a lot of these guys. It shows the current grave now, and it shows the one there at the cemetery in Guadalcanal. This was a ceremony at the cemetery from an honor guard from the 164th. Now, the 164th was given a U.S. Navy Presidential Citation, especially for the Battle of Henderson Field. And as I mentioned before, Lieutenant Colonel Hall was given a Navy Cross, which is fairly rare for U.S. Army officers to get. He was recommended by the division commander himself, especially for their actions on the Battle of Henderson Field. But the whole overall actions, the U.S. Marine 1st Division was given a Presidential Unit Citation for the Battle of Guadalcanal. And because the 164th Regiment was part of the 1st Marine Division for a while, they were included in this. So I won't read the whole thing out. You can pause and read it yourself. So it's pretty good. Signed by Frank Knox there, the Secretary of the Navy. But the 164th was included in this, and they wore the U.S. Navy Marine Presidential Unit Citation on the uniforms. They were allowed to wear it. And here's an example of that. And I think this is a very unique photo because it shows the U.S. Navy Presidential Unit Citation on the left-hand side there. You'll see it on the right below the thing called the ruptured duck, which is that eagle with the circle on it, yellow. That's a Presidential Unit Citation. And another interesting point on this thing, if you look to the far right, you got the Combat Infantry badge, which some of you may recognize, which is the light blue badge with the musket and the wreath. Right below that, you'll see a little diamond-shaped pin. And I figured it should have said 1st Marine Division on it, but that's the first, if you looked at my last episode, that was the first unit insignia for the 2nd Marine Division. So I guess this veteran was attached to the 2nd Marine Division for a while, which I found a bit strange. But they did work with the 2nd Division, but that's definitely a 2nd Division patch symbol there. And then once again, he's got some more of the medals and stuff. And there's his Regimental Crest, and you'll notice that's the division patch he's got there on his sleeve, which is the Southern Cross. It represents the New Caledonia in the Americal Division. He's also got a Purple Heart, which is pretty good, and he's in the Philippines. So brings me to the point. This is the last of my presentation. But after these guys, they left Guadalcanal on the 1st of March, 43, and they went to Fiji for some rest and refit. Unfortunately, he didn't get to go to Australia like the 1st Marine Division, but Fiji at the time wasn't too bad. So they went there, and then they went into Bougainville. After that, the 3rd U.S. Marine Division landed at Bougainville. Then shortly after that, the 164th, with the rest of the Americal Division, garrisoned that area, and was involved in some heavy fighting there at times. And then they were involved in January 45 in the liberation of the Philippines. And on this guy's jacket here, I can see a Filipino Liberation Medal too. So that was the 164th on Guadalcanal. There's a good book. Let me see if I can find it real quick for you. Okay, you can see that. Called They Were Ready. Hope it's not too much of a glare for you, but the 164th in the Pacific War, 1942 to 1943. And I'll mispronounce that if I say it wrong, but Terry Choptaw, hopefully I'm not pronouncing that wrong. But look it up. I mean, it's from the 164th Infantry Association. You can order it. I mean, I ordered it directly over the, I think, Amazon or whatever your good booksellers are. It's a good book. I think it's very accurate. It's got a lot of research in it, a lot of firsthand accounts, and some good maps and drawings on it. So I highly recommend that one if you want to know about the 164th. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation and got something out of it and learned a bit about the 164th. I'm hope to do more U.S. Army units on Guadalcanal, and one day I'll do the 147th, which is a very unique unit too, and the 25th Infantry, which is a very favored unit. So hope you enjoyed it, and if you got any questions about Guadalcanal, feel free to put things in the comment, or I have a Facebook page, Guadalcanal Walking the Battlefield, and where I update almost daily or one or 2 days. I put brand new photos in there, then and now, a lot of information that you won't see anywhere else about Guadalcanal. And if you also have any, questions about Guadalcanal, or if you have any veterans in your family that was on Guadalcanal, send me a PM on that page, and I'll see if I can help you out. All right. Until next time, thank you.